My name is Ira Jackson. I'm Dean of the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies here at UMass Boston. And I'm very proud to host and convene this event, which brings together Professor Maurice Cunningham's political science class and some students, some doctoral students and graduate students at the McCormack School's Public Policy and Public Affairs program, and others from the university who are interested in this topic. We're combining a class with what we call the McCormack Leadership Series, and if you want to hear a little bit more from Senator Cowan, you'll please tune into Commonwealth Journal on WUMB, your university's public radio station, where I'll be interviewing him later this morning. A couple of special introductions. It's a real thrill to have back an alum of the McCormack Graduate School and our founding dean. Steve Tompkins, the Sheriff of Suffolk County, is with us, a proud alum of our MSPA program. And the founding dean, my friend and the chair of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, Steve Crosby. There are actually two Mo's with us this morning, Professor Mo Cunningham. Professor Mo Cunningham, would you stand up and be acknowledged? And former Senator Mo Cowan, but only one is wearing a bow tie, and luckily that Mo isn't wearing a beard. William Maurice Mo Cowan was born in rural North Carolina. He was the first graduate of his high school to attend Duke University. Our good fortune is that Mo came north to attend law school at Northeastern University, and he became a northerner with a southern accent and with decidedly southern charm, which we need more of in our Boston. After joining the prestigious law firm of Mintz-Levin, Mo was tapped by newly elected Governor Deval Patrick as his legal counsel. Among other advice he gave our governor, the choice of Rod Ireland, the first African American to serve as Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Incidentally, Chief Ireland recently announced his intention to step down from his high perch and to relinquish his robes, and the first name that surfaced prominently to replace him, none other than Mo Cowan. But I'm a little ahead of the story, or actually behind the story, as Mo has already quashed that speculation, and he's back at Mintz-Levin, where he is Chief Operating Officer. From legal counsel to the governor, Mo moved on to the hot seat as Chief of Staff to Governor Patrick, handling the full load of responsibilities as the governor's right and left hand, working on everything from the model Massachusetts Gaming Commission legislation to health cost containment and parole board reform. When suddenly, President Obama tapped our then senior senator, John Kerry, to serve as Secretary of State, and parenthetically, in my opinion, our Secretary of State is doing an exemplary and courageous and effective job. Governor Patrick tapped the person he most respects to be his interim replacement, Mo Cowan. For 6 months, Senator Cowan took his seat in the United States Senate, only the 8th African American in the nation's history to do so, and only the second from Massachusetts. When Ed Markey won a special election, Mo returned to Boston, very much a citizen legislator, having done his duty, made his quiet and effective mark, and returned to his wife and kids, where he's always wanted to be. He's been a witness to history. He's made history. He's seen and experienced political paralysis and partisan rancor in Washington, and he's also made friends with folks on the other side of the aisle. He's smart and sincere and warm, and a role model to many of us, to share his story, his journey, his wisdom, his insights, and his advice, as well as his bow tie. Please join me in welcoming my friend and always our United States Senator, Mo Cowan.
Good morning. Good morning. First of all, thank you, Dean Jackson and the team at the McCormack School for inviting me to be here this morning. I'm pleased to be here back on this campus. This is a great university, a great institution, right here in the heart of arguably the greatest city on the planet. And so it is a thrill to be able to stand before you and engage you in conversation. And that is what I hope we do this morning. And first, I'll tell you a little bit about myself beyond that kind introduction, how it is that I came actually to stand before you and present myself as the former United States Senator for this great Commonwealth. But I also want to join in acknowledging Sheriff Tompkins for his great service to the Commonwealth and the people of Suffolk County and the city of Boston. And of course, the former dean and our Gaming Commission chair, who's become a great friend. There's a great story about our conversations before Steve became the gaming chair, which probably is not appropriate for mixed company, but perhaps someday we'll tell you that story. As I mentioned, this morning, I was most excited about this opportunity because it was a chance for me to engage in conversation with you about my own experiences into public life, around politics, around government. And I hope we're going to have some robust question and answer later. But I want to frame that discussion with a little bit more information about myself and who I am and why I stand before you. I never thought I would ever be standing up here. I never thought that I would get this nice pen that they give you when they swear you into the United States Senate. I never thought that anyone would ever address me as senator. I never thought, frankly, that I'd develop an affinity for bow ties. As a matter of fact, when I started out as a young man in rural North Carolina, a very small town, there were about 3,000 people in my hometown. It's called Yadkinville, North Carolina. And the Dean Jackson said that I was the first from my high school, and for the longest time, I thought I was the first from my high school actually to attend Duke University. I've since discovered that is not true, but it remains true that I was the first African-American from my high school to leave my small town and go to Duke, Durham, North Carolina, which for me at the time was the biggest city in the world. I grew up in a rural town. Just 100 yards from my back door were soybean fields and corn fields. And I spent my summers working those fields, sometimes earning pay, but oftentimes being reminded that I was paying a debt for those who had taken care of me throughout the year. My parents both were high school graduates. I am not a child of a political family. I'm proud to say my parents both were committed and consistent voters, but I would not call them political activists. To the best of my knowledge, they never engaged in any political campaigns, but felt powerfully committed to exercising their right to vote. No doubt in part because they were of a generation, or just beyond a generation, that fought so hard for that right to vote. My parents were both children of the Jim Crow South. For those of us who remember our history, this was a sad time in the history of this nation where we foolishly believed in the concept of separate but equal. Fortunately, we now know that that was always a fallacy, and it was a historical accident that caused great harm. Notwithstanding that, my family, my parents, particularly my mother, who is still with us, instilled in my sisters and me the notion that we could never allow outside influences, or should never allow outside influences, to dictate our life and our life circumstances and opportunities. And in hindsight, it's actually fairly remarkable for this woman, she with a high school education, she herself who'd been denied so much merely because the color of her skin and often because of her gender, instilled in her children the notion that in this country, notwithstanding her own experiences, anything was possible. And the only thing that could hold us back was ourselves. And if you're at a young age, and that's the life lessons you're taught around the dinner table, where you're sitting beneath the image of the Holy Trinity, and for African Americans of a certain generation in this crowd, you know that the Holy Trinity in the African American household at that era, you had a picture, and it showed certainly Jesus, but he was flanked on either side by Dr. Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, whose memory is memorialized just down the way here. So around those kitchen tables, it was instilled in us the sense that we could be and we should be anything we want to be, notwithstanding that life would throw us curveballs and obstacles would be placed in front of us. So in some sense, earlier when I said I was not born of a political family, perhaps I was inaccurate. Because I think my mother in particular instilled in us this notion of politics at a very base level. that politics is a vehicle, a means, if you will, to achieve and level the balance for anyone for any particular opportunity, including her children. And so it was with that learning that I graduated from my high school, class of 186. I wish I could tell you I was number one in my class, but I'd be lying to you. I could see the top of the class from where I was, but I was not at the top of my class. But I left my high school with a yearning to see what else the world had to offer. Because again, I came from a very small town where if you graduated from high school and you got a job at the local tobacco company, R.J. Reynolds, then you had hit the jackpot. Tobacco was king. Now in North Carolina, tobacco, like everywhere else, has sort of lost its luster. Those tobacco fields are now providing rich soil to vineyards. By the way, let me put in a plug. If you're a wine aficionado, please purchase from Yadkin County, North Carolina. But you know, it was not common for someone from my high school to go on to a four-year college. And certainly someone at that point, as I was, who wanted to go on to a four-year college because I was intent and I was certain that my life and my career both were going to be forged around the field of medicine. That's right. I stand before you as someone who at the age of 18 was absolutely certain, as is most 18-year-olds, what I needed to do and who I was going to become and how I was going to go about it. And I was going to go to Duke, get a degree in biomedical engineering, then go to Duke Medical School and become the world's most renowned and successful, by the way, anesthesiologist. That was my plan at 18. By 19, that plan had changed dramatically. Changed because for the first time in my life, I experienced real failure. I went to college. As I said, I did well in high school. I wasn't at the top of my class, but I did well. But I arrived on the first day and realized that every student in my class, well, it's probably not true of every student because there I was either the valedictorian or number 2 in their high school class. The cream of the crop. And that was my competition. Certainly they were my peers, but that was my competition. And it's interesting to find yourself in that environment for the first time where through high school you had been told on many occasions, for many circumstances, there was something unique about you. It was a very important lesson for me that first year, that first semester at Duke, because it helped me realize, in fact, and even though I'm going to tell you about my own remarkable, exceptional journey, it helped crystallize in me a truth which I know remains to this day, that there's actually nothing remarkable or exceptional about me. And that my experiences over the span of my life, as remarkable and exceptional as they've been, is not because there's something special about me. It's because I've met a lot of special people along the way who helped me or who helped expose me to those opportunities. But that first semester at Duke, I realized that at my best, I was only as good as everyone else. And that actually level set my own expectations and helped me realize that I needed to be better, to work harder, to strive harder, to be or become whatever it is I chose to be. And if that was not enough alone to convince me of that, my freshman chemistry class at Duke certainly crystallized it. So I talk about failure. I speak a lot these days about my experiences, and lately I've focused a lot on this concept of failure. It's a concept we don't like to talk about. No one really likes to embrace it. We always want to hear about successes. And I'm as much about that as anyone else. But I'm also a firm believer at this mid-stage in my life that success, sometimes the best kind of success, is born out of failure, sometimes abject failure. Many of the best life lessons, career lessons, personal lessons I've ever learned have come first from a failure. And in college, that first semester, I failed miserably at the study of chemistry. You'll remember those moments, and some of you are studying here, and this will be very familiar to you, where you go to your study group, and you're presented with your test results, and they call you to the front of the room, and your paper's folded over, and you peek on the way back to your desk to see where you are in relation to the average and all these other considerations. I remember this moment vividly, as if it happened 10 minutes ago. Freshman chemistry, they called my name at the front of the room, but only after announcing that the high score for this exam was 92. The average, the median, was around 70-something. And the low score was 42. And I thought to myself, I can't believe there's somebody in this room who scored a 42 on this exam. Like, I felt badly for that person. And the only saving grace was I knew that no one else would know, because that person would walk up there and they wouldn't know until they peeked in their paper, and then they'd quietly walk back to their desk in shame. So they go down the list, and as you know, my name begins with C, so it wasn't long before my name was called. Mr. Cowan, or as is often the case in that time, and because no one knew who I was, they would mispronounce it as Cowan. Mr. Cowan, and so I ran to the front of the room, and I grabbed my paper, and you have one of those moments of catharsis, because I opened it up, and there, in its full resplendent glory, was the number 42, in bright red, circled 2 times. And I had this moment, and it probably took me no more than 15 seconds to walk back to my desk, but in those 15 seconds, I made a significant life decision. First of all, I realized that I had failed at something. And again, that was not something I was accustomed to. But in those 15 seconds, I realized I needed to readjust and reflect on what I actually was doing and why I was doing it. Because I realized, or I admitted something I knew from the moment I stepped foot in my first science class at Duke. I knew in my heart of hearts. I knew in my head, but refused to acknowledge it, I was on the wrong path. I didn't really have the interest in the subject matter. I didn't really have the passion for the course of study. And I really wasn't committed, dedicated, invested in the effort that it was going to take to be excellent. And that 42 was a significant, stark, and unassailable indicator that it was time for me to accept that reality. So, and I wouldn't recommend any of you do this. I went back to my desk, and instead of sitting down reflecting on what I got wrong or how I do better, I walked back to my desk and in one smooth motion picked up my backpack and excused myself and walked out the door. And then I went to see an academic advisor, because I realized part of the reason that I was failing is because I had not taken advantage of the resources available to me. I was attempting to do something for the first time I had never done before, but attempting to do it without the good graces and the kindness and the resources that an institution had provided for me so that I could actually be good at it, to excel at it. Because let me tell you, one of the things that I've discovered personally, and I imagine this is true of some of you in this room, the hardest thing to ask for when you need it is help. And it was only after I failed that I realized that I needed help. And I had to look to and lean on others to help me become who I wish to be. And that first conversation with those academic counselors were the most important conversations that set me on the journey that gets me before you today. Because through those conversations, I began to discover who I really was, what my passions really were, and where they might lead me. And they ultimately led me away from the hard sciences, to the social sciences. And I eventually left Duke with a degree in sociology because I discovered I like people. And I like learning about people. I like learning about how we interact, how we relate to each other. And I did well in my major. And ultimately, it was my major that led me to a career in the law, because it was a fascinating class related to our criminal justice system that made me realize the thing that interested me most about being a doctor was pursuing a career or course that empowered me to help people. And I discovered I might be able to do the same thing with a law degree. And so I wound up here in this great Commonwealth at a great institution not far from here, Northeastern University School of Law. Again, for those of you wondering when am I going to get to the politics, I will tell you candidly, at that point in my life and career, I was not at all thinking about politics nor public service. I was intent on getting my JD, going into corporate law, doing well for myself and for others, and then retiring somewhere on some place on the vineyard. It was only after I got here and really got invested in Northeastern and its culture and began to develop a sense of the city that I began to realize the power and the importance and the passion that could lead one into public service. Now, that didn't happen on its own, didn't happen miraculously. It happened because I took with me the lessons I learned from that first semester at Duke, and I started to talk to people who I thought could help me become the kind of lawyer I wanted to be. So I didn't wait to fail, because I'd learned the powerful lesson before of asking help when you know you need it. So throughout my first year, I made a point of seeking guidance and assistance, not just from my professors, but from alumni of the school and from others in the community to whom I was introduced. And I found something remarkable. Almost all of those people, all of whom I came to admire greatly, were involved in some form of public service. Some of them were elected officials for sure. Some of them were appointed officials. Some of them were active in nonprofit activities. Many of them were active in their towns, their communities, in a variety of fashions. Many of them were Little League coaches or some similar activity. But all of them spoke passionately about how much the investment of their personal time in public service brought satisfaction to their lives. And I came to realize, well, maybe I'm missing something here. And maybe to be professionally successful, it's important that you also be personally successful. The two are intertwined. And if I'm really passionate about helping people, then maybe I have to look beyond my office building or my classroom and look for opportunities where I can apply my skill sets, whatever they may be, and however they may develop over time, into sharing some of those with the public for the public good. And if I hadn't crystallized that notion already, it came to bear consistently when I met a gentleman with a rather unusual name who was in this business of the law, who eventually became a great mentor of mine. I was at a function like this. This gentleman was at the front of the room. He was an African-American lawyer. And I could tell, even though I was sitting in the back of the room, that this was a dynamic individual, a leader, certainly in the profession, but there was something else about him beyond the profession that suggested this was someone you needed to know. And so after his dynamic presentation, I went back to my office and I thought for a moment, and I did something I'd never done before. I picked up the phone and I called this gentleman, cold called him. He had no idea who I was, had no reason to answer his phone or take my call, but he did both. And I said to him, "Sir, you do not know me. I saw you speak earlier, and I was impressed, not just by what you said, but how you said it and how you presented yourself. I am a new lawyer. I'm new to this business. I would like your guidance and counsel. In exchange, all I can offer you is a cup of coffee, but I hope that's enough of a down payment for at least the initial conversation." And that gentleman, whose name happens to be Deval Lardine Patrick, said, "Sure. What are you doing right now?" And that phone call happened, and that cup of coffee happened almost 17 years ago. And without reasons or reasons I still don't understand, he was kind enough to invite me into his office and ultimately invite me into his life, and of course, into his administration and then to the Senate. I tell that story in part because it's yet another example of me reaching out for help. It wasn't that I was failing at that moment, but I knew to succeed, I would need help. And so I sought it. And I have discovered in this town, perhaps more so than any other place, when you find yourself in a moment of need, people in this town respond. People who you may not think have any reason to respond positively to you. But there's something about the heart and character of the people in this city that makes them answer that phone and say, how can I help? It's that same kind of attitude that causes many of those same people, and ultimately me, to say, well, how can I help beyond my own circumstances? Why are all these wonderful people involved in public service? And so I began to explore myself, and I began to do things in the public domain that gave me a sense of fulfillment. Initially, it was some nonprofit activity. And then, of course, ultimately, after my friend and now our governor won his first race, he did ask me to join his administration. Before then, candidly, I'd never thought about working in the public sector. Like many of you, perhaps, I only viewed the public sector from a great distance, often influenced by what I read or saw in the media. And so you might imagine that I went into the conversation with the governor with a somewhat jaundiced view of the public sector and it's those in the public service. But what I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I've worked in many places in many roles and worked with many people. I have never worked with harder working people, more dedicated people than when I worked in the public sector. Many stories have been written about the failures, the shortcomings of individuals or certain circumstances in the public domain. And that is okay. Those stories need to be written. But never are there ever enough stories written about the many sacrifices and successes that happen on a daily basis that many of us never know about. The people I worked with in state government and the federal government, particularly at the staff level, are the kind of people I'm convinced could do anything, anywhere, and do it incredibly well. But they choose for our collective good to work in public service. It is remarkable. Every day when I worked at the State House, I interacted with some of the brightest, most dedicated, most committed people in any field you can imagine. Experts, both academically and experientially, in all the important issues of the day. And it was refreshing. When I was in private practice as a lawyer the first time, I too worked with some brilliant people. But no one brought the passion on a daily basis like my colleagues in public service. When I left private practice the first time as a lawyer, I was in search of something. I was in search of that passion that I had started my academic career with. By the end of the first week in public service, I had found it anew. My vessel had been refilled because I was working with people, many of them who'd been at it for much longer than I ever had and ever would, who were committed every day to making life better for everyone else, because that is what public service is about. Too many bad stories have been written, again, about those shortcomings and those failures. But you have to understand what government is here for. It's not a conversation about the government's too big or too small. Government needs to be the right size to be effective for the people who need it most, and often that's the people with the least among us. Government is that thing that binds us together, and it's bound by the efforts and the sacrifices of the many men and women who commit themselves to the work. Government is not some strange, foreign, alien force that seeks to influence and impact our lives. It is a reflection of who we are, our values, and what we stand for. And more importantly, it is the work of our friends and our neighbors who go to work every day trying to make the world better because they understand what's at stake. Government is that thing that binds us. We are a community, we are a commonwealth, we are a nation because government exists to hold us together, often when forces would conspire to rip us apart. And it is those people on a daily basis who get up, often for relatively low pay, who suffer the slings and arrows, who withstand the intense scrutiny when mistakes are made, because make no mistake, they are made, because you're dealing with humans in some difficult circumstances. Yet, they get up every day still and do the work that's required. And I hope we're all reminded of that when we're quick to criticize. Now, they wouldn't want me up here defending them, because they're not. Perhaps some in the audience might. Because they're not in it for the fame or glory. They're in it for the results. They're in it for the notion that they can do something every day to help a friend or neighbor. That is government. That is when government works at its best. That's all those men and women, often nameless and faceless, who give so much for our collective good. That is what I found when I went into public service. The 4 years I served in state and federal government were the four most rewarding and enriching experiences of years of my life, without measure, without equal. And I encourage all of you who are contemplating a career in public service to keep pushing forward and let nothing stand in your way. Remember what my mother told me. The only thing that could hold me back were my own limitations, or the limitations I placed upon myself. Do not let anyone stop you from contributing your passion, your intellect, your sacrifice to the public good, because we need it. Government only works well when people like you choose to work within government and make it work well for the rest of us. I believe that. That's why I came to love it. That's why I made the sacrifices. That's why I defend my colleagues in the public sector at every opportunity, because I know what they're about and what it stands for. That's why I was honored when the governor first asked me to be his chief legal counsel. Turns out being chief legal counsel to the governor is the greatest legal job in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I say that again without any doubt. And I had represented some of the biggest companies in the world, but having the chance to represent the chief executive of the Commonwealth and to work on behalf of the people of the Commonwealth was the greatest legal job you could ever hope for. When he asked me to be chief of staff, I first thought he had dialed the wrong number, but it turned out that job was even better than the last. And the chance to work with every facet of the executive branch, every other branch of government, for the good of the people of Massachusetts, was arguably the most rewarding job I've ever had, and arguably may ever have. Not only did I have to get to pick the chair of the Gaming Commission, or at least make a recommendation, but I got to work on some of the most important issues of the day. Important not because they necessarily impacted me personally, but because they impacted real people every day in every corner of this Commonwealth. That is a rewarding experience. And I will tell you, I was greatly surprised, beyond surprised, shocked, when the governor told me that I was his selection to serve as the interim appointee in the United States Senate. Now, I thought I was a student of history, but candidly, before he appointed me, I didn't realize I was going to become only the 8th African American to serve in the United States Senate in the 270-plus year history of this great nation. Nor did I realize that the moment I took the oath, it would be the first time in the history of this nation that 2 African Americans served in the Senate at the same time. I, of course, knew about the great, distinguished career of Senator Brooke, who was the first African American popularly elected to the Senate post-Reconstruction in this Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I didn't realize that even though I was now going to represent the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I was actually the second native North Carolinian African American to serve in the Senate, the first being the first African American senator, Hiram Revels, representing, believe it or not, Mississippi. And so I knew none of those things, and that's a stark reminder to us all that you will leave here with a distinguished degree, but you should consider yourself in the classroom for the rest of your life. I didn't know those things, and I don't think the governor actually thought about those things when he asked me to serve. But I was honored to make a little bit of history, or become a part of history myself. But I was most honored to have the chance to serve you, to go to Washington, D.C., and represent the people of the Commonwealth I'd come to love. And I was confident I could go down there and work on the issues effectively, because frankly, the issues were the same as the issues we were dealing with here, just from the federal point of view. I was nervous, candidly, about navigating my way literally through the halls of Congress, but I was wise enough to beg John Kerry's staff to stick around, and they were kind enough to do so. But I was also nervous because, like you, I had seen what we often see presented about our Congress, and I wasn't sure what kind of environment I was going into. But because the State House is described in many ways, as many things, but it actually is a fairly collegial environment, even in the most difficult days. But one would have no reason to think Congress is that way. I certainly had no reason. But I will tell you, with great surprise and great delight, I found the Senate to be an incredibly warm and welcoming environment. The first person to greet me after I took my hand off my family Bible, taking the oath from the Vice President of the United States, who after the oath gripped me and pulled me close and said, "You're going to have an awesome time," was Tim Scott, the other African-American senator, but a Republican from South Carolina, a man on probably 98% of each issue I disagree with on policy, but a man who in 6 short months became a very close friend of mine. I used him as an example, and I could offer others. Rob Portman from Ohio, even Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, who remarkably is one of the funniest human beings you'll ever meet. People I developed friendships on the other side of the aisle. You heard the dean refer to it. People often ask me, who did I build friendships with? And I start with the Republicans. Because as a Democrat, I think it's important to give the public confidence that there are relationships in the Congress that are better than those you see on television. Now, it's utterly frustrating that those relationships don't often blossom into collaboration or compromise for the good of the nation. But I'm ever hopeful that we're just a day away from that. Now, it's been several days, but I keep hoping. But I found the place to be filled with extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. And I could tell you stories to no end about anecdotes with Lindsey Graham as we flew to Israel to examine the Mideast crisis and his affinity for Will Ferrell movies. I could tell you stories about freshman Senator Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, and she's spoken publicly about this, her battles with cancer and how that drove her towards public service. But the people who most impressed me in the Senate every day were the men and women who staffed those Senate offices and who staffed the Senate main offices. For those of you who are interested in public service, let me tell you this. If you want to be impactful, if you want to see change happen, if you want to be a change agent, if you want to work in public service at a point in which you really can have influence, consider above all else, certainly initially, serving on the staff at the local, state, or federal level. Because for all those senators and Congress members you see on TV with all their talking points, they're merely reflecting the hard and important work of the men and women back in their offices who actually drill down, do the deep analysis, and form the policy that drives this nation. I'd like to think that I was an effective senator for you in my 6 months. I know that if I was effective at all, it was because I was empowered by an exceptional staff of people, many of them who'd been working in public service for decades, and who, without hesitation, without argument, immediately stepped up when I stepped in and said, "Senator, we will help you do what the people of Massachusetts need you to do." And so as I rounded out my public service career, I left there emboldened even more with the notion that public service in that vein can be the highest kind of service, and that the men and women who dedicate themselves to it are some of the most dedicated people in the world who care not just about themselves, but about the rest of us. And they go to work every day with a passion and a desire to make our lives and our worlds better. So when you're reading the Globe or the Herald or the Post or the Times or Page 6 for the New York Post, of those who read it, remember that there actually, for all those bad stories, there are a million great stories that no one will ever tell you. But you should know that they're happening, because otherwise, this thing we call government, this thing we call our lives, our communities, would dissolve into chaos. And the reason it doesn't is because your friends and neighbors get up every morning and make sure it doesn't happen. And it was my honor and privilege to serve alongside so many of them, and to, frankly, have a chance to prove my mother correct, that in this great nation, there's nothing you cannot do, there's no one you cannot become, if you are committed and willing to work for it, and if you are committed to seeking the help and guidance you need along the way. You too can live out your own American dream, whatever that may be. Trust me, I am a living testament to it. Thank you very much. Yes, this is my real hair. Yes, Devin.
You spoke about passion in the public sector, and as a leader, how does one not make politics personal? How does one sort of separate passion and zeal and effectiveness and productivity from frustration, anger, and how does one, especially if they're the byproduct of systematic oppression or a mute minority?
Yeah, I'm not one who promotes the notion that you should take sort of the personal out of politics or out of policy. Look, I think if you've been elected or appointed, or if you're serving in public service, you can and you should bring your own personal experiences to it. Now, you have to remember at the end of the day what your obligations are, though, right? But your personal experiences will inevitably, unavoidably color your approach to any given issue. Now, you may need to ultimately be agnostic about it or take a very objective viewpoint when the time comes, but I think we have to get past this notion that what we want are sort of unfeeling, uncaring robots in public service. I think it's important that people bring their life experiences, because those, in my opinion, those are the kind of things at the end of the day that lead to good conversations that can lead towards good policy. Nothing happens in a vacuum. The great thing about this country is we today are fully reflective of our history over these many 270 plus years. We're still on that journey towards a more perfect union. But we're not going to get there by forgetting about or ignoring things that have happened or continue to happen around us. That should influence our policy, should influence our thinking. And I think some of the most important conversations I had both at the State House and at the Capitol in DC were conversations that were less about policy specifics, much more about personal circumstances that were going to influence the policy. Because when you talk about the personal issues, you actually get to know something about the person you're talking to. You know, whenever I went into a room to have a conversation, I start the conversations by trying to find out a little bit about the person I'm dealing with, because that's going to tell me a little bit about how they may be approaching the issue or what may be motivating them. And I try to share a little bit of my own experience, because I do think the more you get to know someone, the more likely you are to want to work with that person towards a common good. And if you're nothing more than viewed as an unfeeling, unseeing, sort of hollow caricature, I don't think that's good for public policy. I don't think it's good for government. And I think we need more honesty, more candor in government, because I've often discovered, you know, things that I assume people know and understand about my worldview, they don't. Not because they're ignorant of it or don't care about it, they just don't know about it. So I mentioned Heidi Heitkamp, a freshman senator from North Dakota. I have never in my life been to North Dakota. I don't know what it means to be a North Dakotan and what are the issues that matter there. But if I'm going to sit across the table from Heidi Heitkamp or her Republican colleague on the other side, John Hoeven, if I really want to talk to them about policy and try to work towards a solution, in my mind, I need to understand something about them and their approach to the work. Why are they in government? What do the people of North Dakota care about? And unfortunately, I don't think there's enough of that in politics. There's not enough of that kind of honesty, and I think that's forged, unfortunately, years we've built in this distrust. And there's too much of politics in politics and not enough personal. Because I think at the end of the day, people need to realize, the issues and the policies are not abstract things. These impact real people.
Speak up. Time's limited, so let's go.
I have a question for you. I've known a lot of people in politics in my life, and overwhelmingly, they're very honorable people that care about to try to make sure that the commonwealth of the country moves forward and helps people. But my wife and I have been watching a show called House of Cards. And I was wondering if there was any verisimilitude to your experience. There was anything there you said where you saw it and said, wow, they really got that right? Because it would be frightening if that were the case.
So I'm midway through season 2, so don't spoil it. Don't spoil it for me. I'm happy to report to you that House of Cards is a gross exaggeration of the state of affairs in the Capitol. It's not to say that there aren't all kinds of wheeling, dealing, and that sort of stuff going on, but what I found in my 6 months, and keep in mind it was 6 months, that most of the people I dealt with, if not all the people, in my opinion, were honest brokers. Excuse me. There was much we didn't agree upon, but I never had the sense I was dealing with dishonest people. And I actually do believe, and this may make me seem naive to some extent, I think most people, at least initially, run for and achieve office because they actually hope they can do some good. Unfortunately, I think something happens along the way for too many of those people that sort of no longer is the motivation. I tell this story, being in the Senate is not a bad way to spend the spring and the summer. And so even though I didn't have to run for office, I have a deeper appreciation for those who want to run to get into that high office, because it's a good existence. It also makes me appreciate even more why people work so hard to stay there. Unfortunately, that also makes the issues around money and campaign finance so much more powerful. Now, House of Cards doesn't talk a lot about campaign finance, but I think it's sort of, it's at the root of a lot of that conversation. And people often ask me, do I think Congress is broken? Is it like the House of Cards? I actually don't think it's broken, or at least if it's broken, I think it can be fixed by the people who are actually empowered and employed within it. Anytime Congress wants to, they can stop acting in the manner that we've become accustomed to. They also, by the way, could also change campaign finance. That's a little trickier because the Supreme Court, with some of its recent rulings, have made it a little more difficult. But if there's a problem in politics right now, it's the pervasive, pernicious influence of money. It's not to say that I don't believe people should or should not be able to contribute to candidates or cause they believe in, because I actually do believe that. But I also believe in the notion that there should be some reasonable limits or caps, such that we don't have some of the challenges that have come about in recent years. I also fear that it's going to get worse before it gets better, because the Supreme Court is considering a case right now that would do away with aggregate limits for candidates. And so that will literally open up the floodgates. Unfortunately, I also don't feel like my former colleagues in Congress will do anything about this, because none of them will unilaterally want to disarm themselves. And so it's a problem that's going to continue for some time. I'm not sure how we're going to come to grips with it. But it's not like the House of Cards. There are no Underwoods down there, or there may be, but I didn't run into them. And by the way, for the record, I think I could handle Frank Underwood. Claire Underwood, I don't think I could do anything with.
One more question.
Yeah.
Could I ask if any students, I know you didn't say anything wrong, our students have to run to
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Sure.
Even if you're failing miserably, even if you're failing miserably in chemistry, how is it that you manage to keep going and not give up at all?
It's a great question. Part of it goes to sort of what I said after that. Keep in mind that chemistry episode was sort of my first real, certainly academic failure. And it was through the guidance and the good counsel of those I leaned on who said, look, any failure in and of itself does not make you a failure. And they reminded me with some great examples that some of the greatest successes, or people we know to be successes, first failed at something. And the important thing about failure is, and this is why you shouldn't fear it, you shouldn't embrace it either, let me be candid about that, but you shouldn't fear it, because in order to fail, you must first have tried. And I think too many people fear failure so much that they don't try. And that is the worst kind of failure. And so I listened and learned from people who told me to stumble, to fall, to fail was not fatal. And in the end of the day, that ultimately is what people don't pay much attention to that, believe it or not. They pay a lot more attention to what you do to get back on your feet and what lessons you learn from your failure. And that's what I've tried to live by for the rest of my days. I still live by, because I fail, candidly, frankly, almost every day at something. But in the process, I learn something new, and I apply it the next day. So I've long ago given up the notion of fearing failure. Again, I don't court it, but I know it's there, and that I can't avoid it for the rest of my days. But when I do, I ask myself, what can I learn from it and apply towards my next adventure? And you just got to believe that. You just got to believe it. I submit to you, if you go to the library, you go on the internet, wherever, and you look up any so-called captain of industry, at some point before they became very, very successful, they failed spectacularly. But they failed spectacularly because they first tried something. And that's what put them on the road to success. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
I would like to, just on behalf of the school, the McCormack Graduate School and UMass Boston, give you a memento of your visit. We appreciate it. Let me say one thing to my students. You will have learned more today about how to succeed and how to live a fulfilling life than you may learn anywhere else. Senator, I will say to you that someday soon your phone is going to ring, and one of these young people is going to say, Senator, I was in the audience that day at UMass Boston. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? Thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you. Call anytime.